On October the 2nd, 2025, I traveled to southern Alberta to the town of Nanton, located about an hour south of Calgary, to gather some material for the video I did on Flight Sergeant Nanton and Bomber Command in World War II. After my visit to the Bomber Command Museum of Canada, I looked over and saw there was another museum in one of the old grain elevators. And since I was here anyways, I stopped in for a visit. At one time, grain elevators were very common on the Canadian prairie, and every town would have at least one elevator, and sometimes several, to serve farmers in a time before good roads and transportation. They were known as the Sentinels of the Prairie, and you could always know where you were by looking at the name of the town printed on their sides. But as time passed and grain transport technology improved, sentiment was trumped by progress, and most of the old wooden grain elevators have been torn down. The wooden grain elevators that still exist are like this one, and now serve as museum pieces. Well, let's go in and have a look. As the farmers arrived, their truck would be weighed in full and again after they dumped to determine how much grain was delivered to the elevator. The grain would be dumped through a grate in the floor into the grain pit. Next, the leg, which is a conveyor belt made up of a series of cups, transports the grain from the pit to the top of the elevator, where the grain is dropped into the gerber that directs the grain into specific storage bins or the train car loading spout. Until the grain was ready to be loaded in a train car for shipment, it was stored in various bins located inside the elevator itself or the annex building beside it. The grain was sorted by the type of grain and its grade. During my tour of the Nanton Grain Elevator Discovery Center, I was able to take a look inside some of the grain bins inside the elevator. The tour guide told me that this would have been impossible during the 70 years the elevator was in service because the bins were full of grain almost continually during that time period. When the time came to ship grain to the ports for export or to other customers, the bin containing the needed type of grain would be opened to dump grain into the shipping bin to be weighed. Once that was done, the grain would be dumped back into the grain pit and the leg would send it to the top of the elevator where the gerber would send it down the loading spout to the grain car. When it came time to send the grain to the ports for export or customers in eastern Canada, Canada utilized boxcars well into the 1980s, long after other grain-growing countries switched to much more efficient hopper cars. The boxcars were labor-intensive, requiring the doorways to be blocked before loading to prevent the grain leaking out. Once delivered, the boxcars either had to be hand-shoveled out at smaller customer locations or dumped on very complicated car dumpers at the larger facilities. Both ways slow and inefficient. So why did Canada take so long to convert from boxcars to hopper cars to transport grain? A main part of the cause was the Crowsnest Pass Agreement of 1897, which was a deal between the Canadian government and the Canadian Pacific Railway, in which the CPR received a subsidy and land rights to build a railway through the Crowsnest Pass in the Rocky Mountains between Alberta and British Columbia. In return, the CPR agreed to reduce freight rates on eastbound grain and westbound farm equipment indefinitely, a commitment known as the Crow rate. This agreement was expanded to include the Canadian National Railway as well later on. As time passed along, the Crow Agreement mandated shipping rates to send grain to the ports for export and to other customers in eastern Canada didn't keep up with inflation, and the reduced rate for farm equipment sent west gave factories in Ontario and Quebec an unfair advantage over manufacturers in the western provinces. Eventually, the railways started lobbying the Canadian government to get rid of the Crow rate, which the farmers vehemently opposed. As time went on, Canada's grain boxcar fleet got more and more decrepit. The government and farmers wanted the railways to replace the boxcars, which the railways refused to do. The railways said that what they were allowed to charge under the Crow rate to ship grain was not enough to afford to update the fleet. As Canada's grain boxcar fleet became more and more unusable, and the railways would not replace them due to the cost not being covered by revenue earned by transporting grain, the Government of Canada, Alberta, and Saskatchewan purchased cylindrical grain cars for use by Canada's railways. Manitoba did not join in this venture, as the Manitoba government believed that it should be a federal government responsibility to provide these cars for the railways. But Manitoba did lease 400 covered grain cars in 1980 as a one-time deal to free up boxcars to transport grain to the terminal at Churchill over light rails that were not suitable for the heavier cylindrical grain hoppers. In addition, Manitoba, along with the Canadian government, purchased and upgraded boxcars to haul Manitoba grain to both Thunder Bay and Churchill. The Grain Elevator Experience Museum in Nanton had one of the Canada cylindrical grain cars on display. As a sad note to today's society, this grain car was covered in graffiti, an ugly addition to an otherwise very nice railcar livery. Starting in 1983, the process to end the Crowsnest Pass Agreement began with the implementation of the Western Grain Transportation Act, which allowed rail shipping rates to gradually increase. Moving into the 1990s, government priorities changed, with rising concern about the growing federal budget deficit and additional concerns that the Crow rate could be seen as an unfair subsidy in violation of the North America Free Trade Agreement. The Liberal government of Jean Chrétien ended the subsidy in 1993, and the Crowsnest Pass Agreement was fully cancelled in 1995. When grain elevators were first built in the early 1900s on the Canadian prairies, they were typically located in towns spaced every 13 to 16 kilometers or 8 to 10 miles apart along a railway branch line. This spacing of the elevators was done so that a farmer using a horse and wagon or other forms of pretty basic transportation on roads that could sometimes be less than optimal could get to an elevator with a load of grain and return home in a single day. Also, the steam locomotives used in the day had to have ready access to water every few miles to run. Once spotted at an elevator, the technology to move and load grain cars was pretty basic. Before 1960, a Canadian grain elevator going full speed could load between 1 to 2 boxcars per hour, meaning a total of 24 to 48 boxcars per day could be loaded. Also, to pick up all the grain cars along a branch line, a train would have to stop every 8 to 10 miles, to pick up loaded grain cars and spot empty cars for loading. A very slow process. With improvements in the Canadian road system and better trucks that could haul grain from farms for longer distances in a reasonable amount of time, the grain companies, beginning in the 1960s, began consolidating elevators into larger, more efficient facilities. Today, one of these modern facilities, using loop tracks, can load up to 150 grain hoppers a day at high speed without stopping or detaching the locomotive. With this consolidation by the grain companies to fewer and more efficient grain elevators, the railways began closing branch lines and taking up the tracks. The last wooden grain elevator on the Canadian prairies ceased operation in 1996. I really enjoyed my visit to the Canadian Grain Elevator Discovery Centre in Nanton, Alberta, and learning a little bit about these important structures in Canadian history. And I highly recommend you paying a visit here if you are ever in Nanton. Till we meet again, everyone keep safe and well.